Hi all, today I will be discussing everything you need to know about the air intake system of a Generation 1 BK Mazda 3. Air is drawn in from the area behind the front left headlight into this fresh air duct, which also resembles a saxophone looking thing. It does double duty as an intake air resonator because most everyday drivers don't want that whooshy, sucky, ricey intake sound on their daily commute. The air then feeds up into this box, which contains your panel air filter. This box has a lower portion and a top cover portion, and when you remove it, you can access the air panel filter for maintenance intervals. Once the air passes through this air filter, it goes through this tube on the upper portion, where your mass airflow and intake air temperature sensor is mounted. These sensors take the appropriate measurements and feed information to the ECU to calculate your air and fuel mix ratio. Air then passes through the tube connected directly to your throttle body. So if you're thinking about modifying your stock air intake for something like a short ram intake, there are plenty of aftermarket companies offering bolt-on kits, which replace the airbox section. I've seen two different configurations. One setup is basically a tube with the mass airflow and intake air temperature sensor mounted to it, which sticks straight out with a pod filter mounted to the end that draws in air from the area behind the front headlight. Some of these kits even offer a heat barrier shield in an attempt to isolate drawing hot air in from the engine bay. The other setup is basically the same, except the tube just bends downwards, locating the pod filter lower in the engine bay. For the first style of short ram intake system, you can actually remove this fresh air duct, as it's simply not needed. And you can remove this without actually removing the front bumper, but there's one tricky bolt that you have to access via the front left wheel well. It's tight for space, but it is accessible, only just. Another thing to note is that if you have the air intake set up where the piping curves down, I would advise getting a pod filter that has an open-ended design. Only because this end of the fresh air duct can still be used to draw fresh air in, but if the pod filter doesn't have an open end, the duct feeding it sits flush and the air doesn't actually go anywhere. So now let's talk about a cold air intake setup. You will have to remove that fresh air duct, as a cold air setup basically extends the piping from the curved down intake setup all the way down into the lower portion of the bumper, locating the pod filter in the area behind the lower fog light, where air is drawn in there. The theory is that air is cooler down low as hot air rises. Mazda's engineers have designed the intake system and sensor around a specific volume of air where the sensor is mounted. So if your aftermarket intake pipe doesn't match this volume, due to different mounting locations of the sensor or a different pipe diameter, the calculations and readings sent to your ECU can mess up the air and fuel ratio, which can trigger the dreaded check engine light. Additionally, if the wires and connectors for the mass airflow and intake air temperature sensor are loose or stretched due to vibrations in the engine, they can throw off the signals to the ECU. A code reader is a very useful tool to have, and you can pick up a cheap Bluetooth OBD2 dongle to diagnose certain codes due to this. Codes related to this are low input or high input voltages from the mass airflow or intake air temperature to the ECU. I've attached the pinouts from these sensors to match with the corresponding 5 wires of the harness to make troubleshooting easier. As I said, if these connections are not stable, the calculations for your air to fuel ratio can be thrown off, resulting in your car going into limp mode. Now let's talk about performance gains. A short ram intake, I feel, is sort of a marketing name, as air isn't really being rammed or forced in. It really is just a shorter intake path. I've seen some modifications where people mount the pod filter fed with a hole or duct right from the front bumper, hoping to force air in as they drive. The theory is somewhat valid, but in a car like a Mazda 3, even though one is minimizing restrictions in the intake system, it's still not the main restriction in the engine's ability to make more power. On a turbocharged car, air is actually being compressed, so much that the air actually heats up and requires intercooling. So if you are expecting increased horsepower and torque from an aftermarket air intake system on a naturally aspirated Mazda 3, be prepared to be somewhat disappointed. Yes, manufacturers will publish graphs and try to sell you on performance gains, but what they don't reveal is that some of these recordings could have been done under strict testing scenarios. Results may be skewed compared to real world operations, where you may be stuck in peak hour traffic or experiencing heat soak from the engine bay. From my personal experience, I've found that in colder temperatures, there was some noticeable throttle response increase, and I firmly believe that any gains felt are due to a shift in the power and torque curves, depending on RPMs. In the cold air intake system, I felt the vehicle didn't drive as well from the lower RPMs, such as acceleration from a standstill. But at higher RPMs and at illegal speed limits, there was much better activity. I also felt that the short ram intake setup had slightly better acceleration down low, but this was not that great when temperatures were hotter, like in Australian summers. The stock airbox system was just better all around for daily driving. Who would have thought that Mazda's engineers could actually engineer an air intake system? Now, while I really like the cold air intake setup when the temperatures were lower, another thing to consider is if you live in an area prone to heavy rainfall or where roads may flood. Since the pod filter is down low, you do risk sucking in water and hydrolocking your engine, so it's something to consider. Anyways, I hope that helps. I would advocate for saving your money on an aftermarket air intake system and spending those funds in other areas. Check out my video for value for dollar upgrades to the naturally aspirated Mazda 3. If you really are itching to modifying the air intake system, I would suggest just removing that fresh air duct section and plumbing in some piping from the lower portion of the airbox to draw in air from the lower front fog light. This would be the best of both worlds. Thanks for watching, and if you liked this video or found it useful, please consider liking, sharing and subscribing. See ya!